Welcome back again to the Fedric's Lens. The sky belongs to everyone. Anyone can look up. Anyone can see the moon change. Anyone can notice the return of stars, the movement of light, the rhythm of night and day. But that does not mean everyone holds the same authority over what the sky means. And that is where this part of the story begins. Because once celestial order became more than a recurring pattern, once it became structured, teachable, instrumented, and socially useful, it stopped being a purely common experience. It became something else, a domain of interpretation. And wherever interpretation becomes necessary, a new kind of power appears. Not always violent power, not always official power, not always cynical power, but the power that comes from being trusted to explain reality. That is the threshold here. The sky may be shared. Its accepted reading is not. This is one of the most important shifts in the whole series, because it reveals something that repeats across civilizations again and again. Once reality becomes encoded in systems, not everyone stands equally close to its accepted meaning. That is not a conspiracy idea. It is a structural fact. The more knowledge depends on counting, geometry, tools, procedures, corrections, and disciplined transmission, the more likely it is to gather around specialists. That is how this begins, not with secrecy for its own sake, but with complexity. A person can observe recurrence without training, but to hold structured celestial knowledge reliably, to preserve it, teach it, use it well, and correct it across time, something more is required. Attention, method, discipline, practice, memory shaped by system rather than impression alone. And once that threshold appears, a new social role becomes possible. The interpreter, the custodian, the one who does not only look but reads. This is where the sky stops being only a common human experience and begins becoming a structured field mediated by trained people. That matters more than it first appears, because a civilization does not only depend on what is true. It depends on who is trusted to tell others what is true. That is the deeper social layer hidden inside these tools and systems. The heavens may remain overhead for everyone, but the accepted explanation of their order increasingly gathers around those who know how to handle the language, the instrument, the method, and the inherited framework. That is how asymmetry begins. Not because ordinary people are blind, but because seeing is not the same as explaining. That distinction is everything. 100 people can watch the same sky. Far fewer can explain what pattern is being seen, how it is measured, how it should be used, what counts as error, what counts as correct reading, and how to preserve that knowledge across time. That gap between perception and explanation is one of the great birthplaces of authority. It is where an interpreter class begins to form. And that class does not have to look the same in every world. Sometimes it is priestly, sometimes scholarly, sometimes navigational, sometimes court-centered, sometimes a blend of sacred, practical, and intellectual roles all at once. The outer form changes. The deeper structure stays recognizable. Some people become closer than others to the authorized reading of reality. That is the point. And once that happens, knowledge is no longer only something people have. It becomes something people occupy. A role, a position, a responsibility. That is why the word custodian matters so much here. A custodian is not just a knower. A custodian preserves, maintains, transmits, stabilizes, corrects drift, keeps continuity alive when individual memory fades and generations turn over. That is not a minor function. Without custodians, many systems collapse into fragments. A civilization can survive the loss of some buildings longer than it can survive the loss of the people who know how to preserve and interpret its order. That principle runs much wider than the sky. But the sky is one of the earliest and clearest places to see it. Because celestial order is not self-preserving at the level of social meaning. The heavens repeat on their own, but a society's trusted reading of the heavens does not. That has to be maintained. And the moment maintenance becomes necessary, the role of the custodian appears. This is why specialization should not be misunderstood as only exclusion. It is also burden. The one trusted to interpret does not only gain status. That person inherits responsibility. To preserve knowledge, to teach it accurately, to keep methods from dissolving into noise, to maintain standards strong enough that others can still rely on them. That is why this role carries so much weight. Because when order systems matter, the people nearest to them matter too. And once they matter, authority begins to gather. This is the part that makes some modern viewers uncomfortable, because they want knowledge to feel neutral, purely available, equally held, untouched by hierarchy. But structured knowledge almost never stays that way for long. Not when it matters practically, not when it matters ritually, not when it matters institutionally, not when life begins coordinating around it. As soon as a system becomes socially useful, different levels of access begin to form. Different levels of fluency. Different levels of recognized authority. That is not always abuse. It is often simply what happens when complexity becomes central to survival and order. And yet, authority always changes the social meaning of knowledge. Once certain people become trusted explainers of the sky, they do not only preserve order. They also stand closer to the power of naming it. And naming matters. To name a pattern is to stabilize it. To interpret a sign is to guide action around it. To define a correct reading is to shape how others relate to reality. That is why this episode is so important in the larger arc. Because without it, the story of sky order can sound impersonal. As though pattern, number, tools, and diagrams simply unfolded on their own. But they never did. They always passed through people. People who learned them. People who maintained them. People who taught them. People who embodied them as living continuity. That is how order survives. Not only through objects, through interpreters. And the more a civilization depends on structured knowledge, the more those interpreters begin to matter. This also reveals something deeper about social trust. Most people do not verify every layer of a system for themselves. They rely, at least partly, on those closer to its maintenance. That is true now, and it was true then. A community may see the same heavens, but most people will not reconstruct the full structure of interpretation from scratch. They will inherit a trusted reading. And that trusted reading reaches them through people. This is why the interpreter role is so powerful. It sits between raw reality and socially accepted meaning. That does not mean reality is invented by interpreters. It means the lived access to accepted meaning is mediated through them. And once mediation becomes stable, authority becomes durable. But people alone are not enough to stabilize authority across time. That is the next threshold. A person can teach. A person can preserve. A person can guide interpretation. But if order is going to survive across generations in a stronger way, it needs more than living carriers. It needs visible form. It needs shapes, diagrams, arrangements, surfaces that can teach even before the teacher fully speaks. That is where the story turns next. Because once trusted interpreters emerge, their authority seeks durable expression. Not only in speech, not only in role, but in circles, layouts, charts, and ordered visual structures that make reality itself appear disciplined. That is how interpretation becomes more than a voice. It becomes form. And that is where the next part of the story begins. If this video made you see the world a little differently, go ahead and smash that like button, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Let me know down below what should I cover next. I appreciate you all so much. Catch you in the next video. Look closer, see further, decide for yourself.